In today's show, I am talking to Dr. Rob Boddice, Senior Research Fellow at the Academy of Finland's Center of Excellence in the History of Experiences, Tampere University, Finland, and Adjunct Professor in the Department of Social Studies of Medicine, McGill University, Canada. He is the author or editor of 11 books, most recently Humane Professions, Emotion, Sense, Experience with Mark Smith, A History of Feelings, and The History of Emotions. Feeling This Is in Modern History, co-edited with Bettina Hitzer, will be published by Bloosmbury in the spring of 2022. He is currently completing a book called Knowing Pain, A History of Sensation, Emotion and Experience for Polity Press. Professor Boddice's recent book Emotion, Sense, Experience with Mark Smith, published last year, is the focus of this show. Starting with basic definition of human experience, especially lived experience, we address the central role of emotions in understanding experience, especially experience in the past. In his book, Rob advocates for a broader dialogue on the treatment of the senses and emotions that would lead to a more accurate, robust, and ultimately more meaningful history of human experience. And in doing so, he insists in the reconstruction of context to the maximum extent possible to understand the practical framework in which experience is produced. Otherwise, he says, we risk transfiguring the feelings of others into one's own, imposing the present on the past. But accessing the situated ways of hearing, feeling, touching, sensing is very difficult and has been done so far through a very zoomed-in analysis of the context. The best, he believes, is probably to represent that distance between past and present, and emotions should not be kept separate from the senses, especially when working with experiences in the past. In the second part of the show, we tackle issues related to the role of technology, especially artificial intelligence, in shaping our emotion and sensory awareness, and practices of emotion research in the next decade. And, of course, we had to close with a discussion on whether historians can and should keep AI ethical and on track. Here is the show. Hello, Rob. It is nice to have you on the show.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
You are well known for your work on the history of emotions, history of feelings, history of sensations, and history of experience. What does it mean to say history of X? And how do you define experience, especially felt experience?
Yeah, good question to start off. I think to say that something has a history is to imply that that thing has changed over time, or that at least you can't assume that it's always been the same as it's currently known. Change over time is the historian's métier, really. And that goes as well for things like ideas and knowledge as it does for the experience of the world. So that is how things feel, how things have been perceived, the way that things are colored by situated cultural and bodily practices, as well as beliefs, social relations, and so on. So that's a starting premise. To define experience, actually, that's something I'm trying to resist, not least because there's been a lot of previous iterations of the history of experience, which I would quite like to distance myself from. But mainly, I don't want to lock myself into a tight definition of what experience is, because I think it might defeat the object, which is to historicize experience and to particularize it and perhaps to defamiliarize it. But still, I'm not surprised that people would like a definition. Usually it's the first thing people ask. So there's a group of us in Tampere in Finland who have tried to craft a definition of experience that is specific enough, but also roomy enough to allow us to work. And it's the one thing here that I've written down so I don't mess it up. So what we came up with was this: experience is the relational process of encountering and making sense of the world. And it's a test of that process against one's own and other people's existing explanations. It's a complex relationship of the subjective, the intersubjective, and the collective in practical, embodied, and situated terms. Experience is a dynamic process of giving, making, and disrupting meaning, fitting singular occurrences in the life of an individual or a group into the situated and socially framed knowledge of how things are, or perhaps how things feel, and destabilizing such knowledge and remaking it when those occurrences don't readily fit what we already know. So in short, experience is a product of a complex dynamic relation of brain, bodies, and world. So in a way that points us always to the specific situation without fixing a hidebound definition.
Yes, it's very, very hard to define experience, and not only experience, but emotions as well. In fact, you say in your research that these concepts are very, very challenging, and therefore the striving for timeless or essential definitions is futile. Now, for many years, research on emotions in different disciplines has followed rather divergent tracks, with no apparent hope to reach agreement on the object of study or the approach or representation across disciplines. Yet you believe that the history of emotions aligns well with the rising movement of biocultural brain within social neuroscience, although we agree that it has not really given us answers to what emotions are and how they should be researched. In addition, you propose an alignment of transdisciplinary focus as a possible solution to some of these conceptual and methodological differences. Could you please elaborate on the current status of emotion research, perhaps starting with the now historical and fundamental disagreement within the discipline of psychology? So, are emotions cognitive or non-cognitive? Are they universal or cultural dependent? How should they be researched?
Well, so that's a lot of big questions in one question. So I think that the schism in the discipline of psychology that falls along these binary lines is still present, it's still active. It's preserved, I think, by institutional and funding logics, and it's preserved by certain powerful personae who are heavily invested in one view or another. And I think that gets in the way of cracking this problem. For me, the evidence against universality and even against these kinds of binary division between cognitive and non-cognitive, or even conscious and unconscious, and certainly between nature and nurture or nature and culture, the evidence against these things is kind of overwhelming. It's not just that there's a strand of evidence within psychological research, but there's evidence that bridges research in different disciplines, where I think most psychologists don't spend a lot of time, whether it's in philosophy. I'm thinking especially of the sort of neurophilosophy of someone like Thomas Fuchs, whether it's in cultural anthropology or sociology, or indeed in history. And historians, for our part, have demonstrated using really a massive amount of data, which covers the whole world and thousands of years, an incredible richness and variety of emotional experiences that it seems to us, I think history has kind of moved on to continue this debate about universal or culturally constructed or cognitive, non-cognitive. These things, they feel a little bit tiresome in a way. So I think many of us have started now from the point of view that that debate is done, although I know it's not done across the disciplines. A lot of historians would strongly favor a cultural constructionism or social constructionism. But as you say, I prefer this biocultural explanation, which accounts not only for cultural, social, conceptual, political, and intellectual change over time, but also emphasizes the way that these things are interwoven with brain-body plasticities, which are mutually formative of each other and unstable in their dynamic relationship. Now, for me, whether you call it social neuroscience or cultural neuroscience, this body of work has implicated the importance of the world in the study of emotions, but it is still an interior focused and a brain-centered discipline. And so when I call for a kind of radical interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity, I'm trying to emphasize and bring into focus this relationality and the lack of a gap between the bio and the cultural. So in some ways, I'm aligning the history of emotions with the bioconstructionism of social neuroscience. But in doing so, I'm not proposing to sort of knuckle under to social neuroscience. I actually think that humanities disciplines like history should be equal partners in the way that emotion knowledge is produced, and that there should be genuine collaboration rather than a hierarchy. And so thinking forward, I think we're looking at potentially a lot of compromises on all sides, and some of them may be quite large compromises.
Yeah, you mentioned compromises, actually a very good point of transition to the next question. Where exactly is this point of understanding that everybody might agree on? And this is because one big question that comes up in many fields, many disciplines, is how many emotions, human emotions, are out there? And should one study them in isolation as analytically discrete categories, or in combination as a tightly interrelated whole? If we study them in isolation, then the next big question is, should we follow the popular 6 emotion categories approach, meaning Paul Ekman's classes given us by popular psychology, or should we have some other set of emotions? In fact, as one of the critics of siloed categories and practices, you suggest to collapse parcels of categories of reason into a more inclusive category that you call felt experience. Why should people follow your suggestion here, and how exactly could one do that?
Well, if we're talking about a sort of future best practices for this kind of collaboration across disciplines, which I would really like to see, then I can't at the moment say what that would look like, because I feel like we're still in the talking about it phase. And there's actually resistance on all sides, because it's not just that I'm reaching out to other disciplines and trying to find the soft entry points, but I'm also trying to bring historians with me, and there's resistance there too. I don't know whether you call this sort of mutual suspicion or what, but I think that our disciplinary training provides an obstacle, gets in the way of doing this stuff, and it's difficult to break out of it. I think one recent set of suggestions, which I really liked, was provided by Daniel Gross and Stephanie Preston in an article in Emotion Review in 2020, where they called for something like a real-world generalism in the way that psychological research took place, which would lead to knowledge production that would not be so far removed or siloed from lived experience. And they had this slogan, always historicize, which I fully subscribe to. In fact, I would like to get t-shirts printed. They've made a blueprint, which I think sounds good to me for psychologists. And I think we need to do something similar for historians. As for reason, so I think historians are not alone in arguing and documenting that a kind of binary or a division between emotion and reason is not really sustainable, that thinking and feeling are of a piece. And I've thought a lot about the language of feeling and the way that the phrase "I feel" often refers to a process of reasoning as well as to a process of emoting in a way. There's a lot of mileage to be gained here by exploring the kind of blurry boundary between emotion and reason. Now, about Ekman, so I would go on the record quite happily as saying that there's no limit to the number of human emotions, and that they're not all easily captured or well described by that word emotion either. And I noted a couple of weeks ago that even Ekman has recently upped his number from 6 to 7, which, you know, I'm not sure what that tells you, but it's fascinating to me. You can take a hard line and then add one. But in any case, the basic emotions model isn't tenable in my view. The research methods upon which it's been based have been mortally criticized, and the evidence that speaks against it is overwhelming. But, and this is really key, it exercises huge cultural power, especially in Western cultures. And one of the things that historians look at in the past is the way in which emotions are prescribed or scripted, and by whom or what, and with what kind of authority. William Reddy famously called this an emotional regime, which is about delimiting the range of emotions that are socially permitted and steering subjective experience into these prescribed categories. And it seems to me that the Ekman model, which is disseminated through things like highly grossing Disney Pixar movies, as well as being implemented in schools through specially designed American emotion recognition and control training programs, is a perfect example of an attempt to craft an emotional regime. The basic emotions approach is ostensibly about reading and measuring emotions, but in effect, it's become about creating them, about forming them, and placing evaluative meanings on these prescribed categories. So even my son, who goes to an English daycare in Finland, he is part of this emotional recognition and training pedagogical program, which has been bought from an American company. And to me, this is like a kind of emotional imperialism, even if it's unwitting. I follow the bioconstructionist logic here, which is if there were a successful campaign to make certain emotional concepts and practices and expressive displays into a kind of orthodoxy, then it will, if you do it well enough and, completely, and if you have the kind of a political heft as well as a cultural heft, then it will come to fulfill itself as true. But it wouldn't do so without consequences. It wouldn't do so without suffering somewhere or without some kind of ambiguity. And it wouldn't do so forever. And I think, historians can testify that these kind of regimes, they come, but they also go away again.
Ekman's categories of emotion are still one of the de facto representations in artificial intelligence. AI, in fact, is way behind history of emotions and history in other fields. So we believe that emotions and the senses are central to understanding human experience. Yet it is very, very difficult to really define this. And there are fields which cannot really process these concepts without some definition in place. And of course, I'm referring here to AI in particular. Yet objectivity is not only field dependent, but it's also within each field very hard to define. In fact, you cite Lorraine Daston and Peter Gallison. They pointed out that an affect, a posture of situated scientific practice, is actually in place rather than a true understanding of the world. So I think many fields like to get to a true understanding of the world. It's just that we don't know how, especially in AI, which is such a practical field. So what is the best way to access this understanding of lived human experience through emotions? Could you give us a short summary of how historians have addressed this in the past? And do we have what we need here currently? Methodology, interpretive practices, and other tools?
Well, I would start by saying that for historians, we sort of take it for granted that history is always partial in both senses of the word. So the historian always leaves a mark in the knowledge that they produce. History is inflected through the historian. It's a practice of writing. It's constructive. But I would extend that observation, which is taken for granted in history, and say that it's no different to the way that all scientific knowledge is produced. It's all situated and it all comes through institutional and individual acts of making knowledge. That sense of partiality is everywhere. That shouldn't be something that stands in the way of a pursuit for a true understanding, but something that should be embraced as part of trying to reach a true understanding. The other sense of partiality is a bit more problematic in history, which is that you're dealing usually with data that's incomplete. Sometimes you're dealing, especially in more recent history, you're dealing with data which is so overwhelmingly abundant that you can't possibly process it all. But in general, I think historians will attest that the historical record is so full of silence where we would most wish to find a voice. And That's why I insist on the reconstruction of context to the maximum extent possible to understand the cultural and social, political, the material, intellectual, linguistic, and practical framework in which experience is produced. So when you come across a strange feeling word in the archive, or an unfamiliar expression or gesture, or an intersubjective encounter which doesn't make any sense on first reading, these can often be unlocked by an understanding of context. I also try to resist translation in favor of explication. So one of the worst sins, and I think this is a methodological sin across a number of disciplines, is to assume that an emotion category somewhere else, whether it's another place or another time, can be readily translated into a contemporary Anglophone psychological category. And I think that kind of mistake derails the purpose of the work, which is try to understand feelings in context. So I think it's always better to try to explain what things mean in context than to risk transfiguring the feelings of others into one's own. And I call that a sort of emotional ventriloquism. And when applied to the past, it's almost like we're imposing the present on the past, and it should never be that way around. I prefer to let historical actors speak for themselves, but in order to understand what they say, you have to do so much reconstructive work. Can we access their feelings on an experiential level? No, probably not. But that's the point. Their feelings were theirs, not ours. So theirs then, not ours now. And I think the best we can do probably is to try to represent that distance. And that goes for the senses as well as for the emotions. And to me, it often makes no sense to try to preserve the distinction between emotions and senses. The historical record, more or less wherever you look and whenever you look, apart from in the last 150 years of English language history, does not preserve this distinction between emotions and senses. So it doesn't make any sense to start with that distinction. And I often think about an art historian called Michael Baxendale, who many years ago, writing a book about the Florentine Renaissance, referred to what he called the period eye, which was an embodied and situated way of seeing that was particular to a time and place. And I think it's a good idea to extend that kind of contingency to all the senses, including the sense of one's interior, as well as being open to senses that fall outside of the canon of the usual five, let's say, because the historical record presents us with all kinds of unusual things, which to the people who lived them were real.
Yeah, so the emotional meaning of perception, what exactly did the person in the past feel, and how the historian understands that, as well as how the historian actually puts this in writing for their audience. And this actually takes into account, I assume to some extent, auditory habits of the various audiences. To what extent can this be translated? And how much is lost through this translation?
That's a good question. And to some extent, we probably have to live with not knowing the extent to which we're losing something. And of course, to come back to the question of partiality, we also have to accept as historians that the vast majority of our sources are written. And so, the written source is by no means an invalid source for doing the history of emotions and senses and experience, but it is limited. It comes with certain problems about creation and mediation and voicing and the question of immediacy, like what are you actually accessing when you're accessing experience through a text? There are other sources too, visual material and so on, but accessing those situated ways of seeing and hearing and touching, it's very, very difficult. What's been done so far has been done through a very, very fine-grained reconstruction of context, searching for a way to make sense of the meanings that get recorded. And I think all we can do is do our best to represent what we find, but also to represent the fact that often what we're finding is alien to what we might know. And I think for a long time in, say, 20th century historiography, that wasn't the impetus. The impetus in some way was to emphasize a great continuity in something called human nature. And that often meant overriding the situated meanings that people were finding in the archives in favor of trying to make sense of past experience in order to understand our own. And I think this is now flipped completely, where this need to make a connection along the lines of a continuous human nature is gone. And if it emerges through the historical record, fine, but I don't want to assume it. So that might not be a very satisfactory answer, but I think there's enough evidence to be able to demonstrate difference in the way that senses and emotions are experienced, even if we ultimately fail to fully account for them.
You already mentioned interdisciplinarity. You, as well as many historians in the past, have stressed the critical need for an interdisciplinary approach to the history of emotions. However, in your recent book with Mark Smith, Emotion, Sense, Experience, you specifically call for a broader dialogue on the treatment of the senses and emotions. What kind and how wide of a collaboration do you think would advance our understanding of emotions and the best practices here, and why?
Well, I mean, I think in any number of different disciplines, we've arrived at asking the same fundamental questions from different directions. And the fundamental questions are something like, what does it mean to be human? And how is that meaning produced in a nutshell? And I think we all set about in our sort of different disciplinary logics, we set about approaching the answers to those questions by radically different methods. We have different guiding assumptions, and usually we're not paying attention to each other, because paying attention to each other makes life really difficult. So I simply ask at this point, I've been asking for a while now, is what would it take to really provide answers to these questions? That is, answers that aren't answers according to disciplinary logics, but actual answers. So if there is to be a collaboration across disciplinary lines, I don't think it can actually sustain disciplinary identities. There's so much to be gained by the broadest possible coalition, but probably we'll all have to give up something in the bargain. And I think, there's no better way to gain an understanding of your implicit disciplinary assumptions than to work with someone from another discipline, because they point them out straight away. So if we look at each other, as it were, over the disciplinary garden hedge and decide, no, we're not compatible, and then we just go back to our divergent tracks, I ask seriously, what's the value of the knowledge we're producing then in isolation? The feeling human is a biocultural entity, and multiple disciplines acknowledge this. And if we want to truly study it, then the division between those disciplines that focus primarily on the bio on the one hand, and those that focus primarily on the cultural must be bridged. So if we're collapsing the binary between bio and culture, then probably we also have to collapse disciplinary boundaries as well. And I understand when I say this, how many barriers to such a thing are in the way. But I think talking to you, talking to other people, these are the beginnings of truly beginning to understand fundamentally where we come from, where we differ, and what we need to iron out.
Yes, and this podcast actually has started with this very idea of bridging disciplinary boundaries. I don't think we can actually make improvements to really understand experience, emotions, and senses if we don't do that. Yet it is hard. It is so hard. And you say, in fact, that we have first to agree that we share a common purpose and a basic understanding. And I don't know to what extent this is possible. It's easy to really follow practices we are very used to. But I think it's also a movement that has started and it will see results. Now, more specifically, What do you think the role of the humanities, social sciences, and the arts is in this interdisciplinary approach?
I actually feel that it's interesting, historians, anthropologists, sociologists, art historians, literature scholars, so on, all in the last 20, 25 years started talking really extensively about emotions, senses, about situated meanings. And in the same time span, social psychology, social neuroscience started heavily implying that you couldn't do this science without taking fully into account the cultural situatedness of people and their situated language and concepts, but also the situation of bodies in certain places and environments and so on. So it seemed to me that we were both gesturing at the other, but very, very few have taken the plunge and tried to actually cross-pollinate these two strands of knowledge production. It seems to me that it's absolutely essential. So like current broad definitions of what social neuroscience and emotion research is, talks about culture in almost every other word, and yet it doesn't investigate it. It investigates the human interior and the brain. And I think it's not that people in the humanities want to somehow complete the social neuroscientific mission, but that a real picture will only emerge when we entangle ourselves with each other and realize that we need each other, because our training is very, very specific. And we're looking, when we don't look at each other, we're just looking at a part of the picture. And it won't be a full picture until we agree to collaborate. So I actually see the humanities, social sciences as equal partners in this. I know that many of my historian colleagues are worried that in embracing psychology, neuroscience, that somehow we have to doff our caps or acknowledge that they produce a kind of knowledge about the world or the human, which is somehow more scientific and more rigorous. And I reject that hierarchy and try to tell my colleagues, no, like if we do this, we're doing it as equal partners, because it's not that we have to just sort of subscribe to a core idea of social neuroscience. I think if we really try this relationship, we will both have to surrender some core ideas, some core assumptions.
Yes, and I also believe that it is time for technology sectors to also sit at this table equally and really engage in this interdisciplinary movement. So this is actually a nice transition to our next question, which is about technology. I personally believe, and I'm not the only one, by the way, that artificial intelligence is really behind what is going on in other fields as well. We still have a very poor understanding of context, in particular situated context. Now, as you know, the main approach to designing and building artificial intelligence to recognize emotions and expressions of emotions has been empirical, relying on usually large data sets, either text, speech, or image, using the discrete and universal categories of representation, mostly Ekman's set of emotions. Overall, the performance of such systems has been rather disappointing, although, of course, it is difficult to generalize. And we can add to this the backlash from the ethics community on the rather concerning societal implications of deploying such AI systems. For instance, the neuroscientist and psychologist Lisa Feldman-Barrett and colleagues have questioned the universality of facial expressions and concluded it is rather impossible to infer specific emotions reliably from pictures of faces. And, this applies to some extent to text as well as other types of data. When it comes to technology, she says it's not about machines not being able to perceive emotions. It seems companies approach the problem in a wrong way due to the fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of emotions. However, she, as well as others, believe that if done properly, this can be a great opportunity to transform the science and its application to societal problems. Now, what change in our understanding of emotions can lead to the right technology, right here between quotes? I would love to hear your opinion on this.
Well, I mean, I agree with the way that you've sketched the sort of landscape of problems and opinions about AI. I think the risk with AI, as with other iterations of Ekmanism, and I mean, I touched on this already, is that what appears on the surface to be a means of measurement or capture is actually a means of production. And that this means of production it comes with a pre-baked set of values built into it. And I think if it were acknowledged that AI is about making, not capturing, then it might reframe the ethical considerations somewhat. So in the main, I would say that it's definitely hubristic and also wrong to think that we can nail down what emotions look like and how looks relate to feelings for all time and all places. It would be wonderful if that were true, because it would be so convenient, but I'm afraid that evidence just doesn't support it. Time has already told that it won't work. So maybe if we were to begin again, perhaps, by recognizing the extent to which we are situated, that our own emotions and senses are contingent and framed, then we might rein in our technological ambitions and instead make something more specifically useful for our own times and on our own terms. But I think, the caveat here is, what do we mean by our? Like, who are we? It's the perennial thorny question. It always excludes someone. It always privileges someone else. But if we at least acknowledge that through emotion AI, we are as likely to be trying to condition, train, control, or frame a certain culturally and temporally specific emotional repertoire, then the ethical considerations can begin there in a healthier place than they do when it's simply assumed that emotions look and feel the same for everyone, everywhere, forever. So my basic take is that a certain very convenient set of assumptions about human feelings has been simply taken on uncritically, and people have started to practice. And I think we actually have to go back a step and undo the first principle.
It's hard to undo things, but of course, it's absolutely necessary. You mentioned many times, not only today in our discussion, but in your research, how important it is for emotion research to stop being done on divergent tracks. If this is going to happen, and I think it will, it means that some branches of emotion research will thin out or even disappear. Now, we might agree that some digital technologies, in particular AI, are definitely here to stay. They're not going to disappear, and will continue to have significant impact on the development of humanity, even though, as any other technology, AI can be used for good or for bad. Many people, me included, believe that there is an enormous potential for good in emotion AI. It can help us better understand and regulate our own emotions and greatly improve our quality of life. It could save many lives. It might help us get through global pandemics like this one, and even through financial crisis. How do you see the role of the technology, in particular AI, in shaping our emotion and sensory awareness, as well as practices of emotion research in the next decade or so? Specifically, how do you see the role of immersive technologies in helping historians of the felt experience of others to access the past or the present? So Alain Corbin famously said to borrow their glasses and live their emotions. And if we turn this around, one of history's oldest and most traditional roles has been that of criticism. Yeah. As you say in your books, historians have long assumed some practice of keeping other disciplines honest, in part by exposing assumptions presented as neutral or objective facts. Can and should historians keep AI ethical and on track?
I suppose I should preface what might be a lengthy answer by simply saying I don't know to all of it. I don't know what the role of technology will be in shaping emotional awareness, and I'm not really sure what historians should do. Most historians get a little bit dizzy when we start to look to the future. That's not what we do. But I do think that your question or questions contain, for me, an essential observation. AI will have a significant impact on the development of humanity. It will be transformational. It will change us. I mean, I think, even looking at the last 10 years of the way in which people engage with the world online, say, and the AI components of that has changed us. And I think that's key. I think it's key to say that AI is not about representing humanity. It's not about tapping something essential about humanity, but it's about fundamentally doing something to humanity. Insofar as humanity is always in development, AI or no, humanity is always in development. And I think it would be foolish and unproductive and unhelpful to try to resist change, but it makes sense to try to control change, to steer it. So if AI is to be a force for good, as you say, then for me, the starting point has to be that it is designed fundamentally to be transformational. It's not designed to be neutral. It's designed to do something. It has a power. And because of that, it's really important to know, and perhaps this is where historians and other humanities and social sciences disciplines come in. It's really important to know who or what holds that power and how do they wield it and to what ends in transforming us, in making humans anew, changing the way we interact and the way we feel and the way we practice how we feel. Who wins? Who loses? Who suffers? Who's excluded? Who's overridden or invalidated? I think, from a history of emotions point of view, we know that in all emotional regimes, there are always losers. Power is wielded in any number of ways, not least through technological innovation, especially in the service of capital, and it always has consequences. And future emotional regimes won't be any different in this, but those who shape them might be well served by some historical reflection about the social and cultural and political implications of what they're doing. I mean, we are, as a species, not in emotional stasis. We are primed for disruption. We are plastic by our bicultural status. Now, the history of experience, I don't think, can provide any answers to either present or future problems, but I do think that what we've already produced and what we're producing now might enable us to ask better questions with greater reflexivity and with greater political and ethical awareness. So yeah, I think that does refer to history's role in keeping people honest. Whether AI can be used in some way as part of the historian's toolbox, it's a really interesting question. I'm trying to think, one might imagine taking contextual modeling to such a degree that you could see what might have happened or how people might have felt in a given situation if you can recreate it. But history as a discipline is kind of averse to prediction. However much it tries to articulate silences, it's a fine line to walk. And I think it sort of speculative construction, it might have been like this, actually takes us right the way back to the father of history, Thucydides in ancient Greece, and the way that he reconstructed speeches in his history. And so where he couldn't offer a reliable account of what was actually said, he recorded what should have been said given the circumstances, based on what he knew about the context and the people and the situation and what humans were like. And then he filled in the blanks in the record from his imagination. And he didn't call it fictive. He didn't in any way gainsay the truth of what he recorded. Context supplied the key. Now that method, interpolation, interpretation, reconstruction, has remained really controversial, a talking point in historiography for 2,500 years. So AI might reinvigorate that debate. And it could be useful. Will it settle the debate? I highly doubt it.
You say in your research, if history's contribution to emotional knowledge means anything, then it should mean the disruption of the very starting point of emotion research. And I agree with that. I also believe that this idea, this disruption will happen, will penetrate more and more disciplines. And this includes AI as well. The research you're doing is really raising very important questions that people should sit down with and try to reevaluate their research and their practices. I really liked your book and your research in general on the history of emotions and experience. Now, how can our audience learn more about you, your books and your research? How can you be reached?
I am very fortunate out there in the world to be, as far as I can tell, the only person with my name. So I'm the most easily Googleable scholar out there. Search for Rob Boddice and you'll only find me. My website's robboddice.com. You can tweet me at virbeatum, but a simple Google search or a Google Scholar search will point you easily in the right direction.
I really like our discussion today, Rob. Thank you much for your time. This was great.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really great to talk over the disciplinary hedge.